Wizards keeps pumping out all these sets. I'm going to keep pumping out these PowerPoint videos talking about all of the modern playable cards in them. Outlaws of Thunder Junction is a standard set that I think is going to make a big impact to modern. There's several cards I think may end up just being format staples, and there's several other cards I think are going to be awesome, really cool build-arounds. There is a lot to cover, so let's get into it. I've already covered some of these cards in a previous video. The first day of spoilers for Thunder Junction was just so exciting. I'm going to cover them again with some updated thoughts too. I want to lead on what I think just has to be the best card of the new set, Sotoro the Infiltrator. Sotoro is a 2-mana super powerful card advantage engine that works with a ton of good cards in Modern and works with some bad cards too. Sotoro is a blue-black 2/3 menace for 2 mana that says whenever it or another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, and if no mana was spent to cast it, or if it just wasn't cast, you get to draw a card. This means if you cascade into Sotoro the Infiltrator, you get to draw a card. If you have a Norn the Wary in play, and this card is coming back on each instep, you get to draw a card on each instep. Ephemerate, every time you ephemerate a creature, you draw a card. So you draw a card when you ephemerate it the first time, and then on the rebound. When you Aether Vial a creature in, you get to draw a card. When you evoke an Incarnation, you get to draw a card. When you cast a creature for 0 mana, you draw a card. You mill over an Archimedes, draw a card. You unearth something, you draw a card. You return a Bloodghast, you draw a card. And this is just like, honestly, a short list. There's kind of like almost no it feels like there's no limit to interactions with Sotoro the Infiltrator. It feels like every time I feel like I've explored all of them, there just is more. This is going to be an incredibly good card advantage engine in Modern. It's going to be a tool that a variety of decks try to utilize, and to some extent it kind of reminds me of Up the Beanstalk in the sense that it's this 2-mana card advantage engine that there may be like a similar arms race where everyone is trying to find the best Sotoro deck. One thing I expect is that I expect Sotoro to be a more powerful card in some decks. Like if you're playing Norn the Wary, like Sotoro just gets so much more powerful. But does that mean it's the most powerful deck overall? You have to, there's this trade-off with like card quality and synergy that you have to evaluate. I'm really excited to try it. I think this card is going to be super good. It's also a human ninja rogue, which are at least 2 of those creature types are somewhat relevant in the format. Menace on a ninja is pretty good if you ninjutsu Sotoro. You also get to draw a card if you ninjutsu something, which is maybe part of the intended purpose. I know the plot is the real intended purpose, so keep an eye out for this one. This one is going to be huge, in my opinion. I think just going to be absolute Modern staple. While I think Sotoro is the best card in the new set, I think that Magna the Hordemaster is my favorite card from the new set. I was a big fan of the old Magna, who was a 2-mana 2/1, sacrifice 5 treasures, get an artifacted dragon from your deck. And I tried to build around that card in Modern a few times when it came out. Outside of like the Clock of Omens combo deck with Magna, that card just ended up not being very playable, but that card was kind of bad for 3 reasons that this Magna just kind of fixes completely. 1, it has 2 toughness. Having 2 toughness in the Ridden 6 Orcish Bowmaster format is just super important for your 2-mana creature to be playable. Additionally, one big problem with the old Magna is you have to put a bunch of bricks in your deck. You have to put these like crazy expensive dragons. You have to put these big artifacts in your deck for them to like be worth searching, which is a problem to have like dead draws in Modern with no brainstorms to take rid of them. Maybe you have some looting, but it's a very awkward part of that Magna. This Magna, however, you just sacrifice 3 treasures and you make a 4/4 Scorpion Dragon. Very cool. With flying and haste. So you don't have to put these dragons in your deck. You just make the tokens, which can make your deck a lot meaner, leaner, and lower to the ground. And sacrificing 3 treasures it's just so much less than 5. So much less than 5. So getting up to 5 treasures was pretty tough. And Magna will also be able to make a lot of treasures by herself. Whenever you commit a crime, make a tap treasure token, this ability triggers only once a turn. The best enabler for this, and like also every other card in Modern, is Mishra's Bauble. You can go, I would recommend playing Bauble before Magna, so this way you will not get your Magna removed in response to casting Bauble. But you can go Bauble Magna, crack Bauble, get a treasure. Also, if you have a Relic of Progenitus, you can just target your opponent on their turn to make a treasure too. In fact, if you just have turn 1 Relic, turn 2 Bauble Magna, you go make a treasure on your turn, make a treasure on their turn, untap, make a treasure with Relic, have a dragon, which is pretty cool. Also, Enterprising Scallywag has been like a really cool token generator, treasure generator that I've been playing in some other decks and liking it. It also makes a treasure if you crack a Mishra's Bauble, which is cool. Obviously, Ragavan's going to go in these decks too. And I'm really excited. Also very notable, this ability, Magna's ability, is Agatha's Soul Cauldronable. So if you happen to play Soul Cauldron in your Magna deck, you can uh, maybe just let your Magna die and then start, just using all of your creatures to make dragons. Really excited about this Magna, have high hopes for it. We will see how it plays though. Pillage the Bog is a card that I think is very good, but also a card that I don't think fits super well into any existing deck, with the exception of maybe Cabal Coffers. It's very reminiscent of the Alchemy card, Assemble the Team, which is something I've been playing in Timeless Summon, really been liking it. Assemble the Team is a 2-mana sorcery that says, search the top third of your library, round it up, put that card into your hand, then shuffle. Pillage the Bog is not quite as powerful, but it's also a 2-mana card selection black-green sorcery. It allows you to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is twice the number of lands you control, put one of them in the hand, rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So minimum, this is going to be a 2-mana sorcery speed impulse in green-black. You also have the ability to plot it for 3 mana. I think this is one of the only cards where the plot cost is more expensive than the casting cost. But what's cool is if you plot this on turn 3, untap, play your 4th land, you get to look at top 8 cards for 0 mana, then maybe find the One Ring and cast the One Ring, or find Damnation, cast Damnation in your Cabal Coffers deck. I think you're not going to plot this card very often, I would guess, but I think that you will do it against like blue decks that are obviously holding up a counterspell. I think that seems like the most common case where you would use the plot. But just for a 2-mana card that sees 4 cards on turn 2, 6 cards on turn 3, 8 cards on turn 4, etc., is an incredibly good card selection spell. I think that this is a card Cabal Coffers could be very interested in splashing, although this would come at the cost of having to play less Field of Ruin effects, which is kind of an interesting trade-off, but would be like an incredible consistency enabler, which is like the biggest hurdle for that deck to jump through. And splashing green is also something you kind of are incentivized to do in Modern anyway because of Pick Your Poison. I am very optimistic that we'll see this card in other decks in the future. Could we see this in Ad Nauseam combo decks? Could we see this in other combo decks? I think we're not going to see it in like Jund or mid-range decks. Going to be like a big mana combo card, but a really, really cool one that I want to cast really badly. Jace Reawaken is definitely a really exciting card. It's one that has been super hard for me to evaluate, but at the moment, I think the card is good. I think the card is, in fact, very good, but we will see. So this is the third 2-mana Planeswalker ever, Jace Reawakened. You cannot cast the spell during your first, second, or third turns in the game. I believe you should be able to cast this on your opponent's turn with a Leyline of Anticipation, because it on the card it says you cannot cast it on your first 3 turns. I have seen some people online saying that that's not how this works. So I guess we'll see. Maybe people already know and I'm late to the party, but I'm at the moment of recording under the impression that you can cast this on turn 2 if you have a Leyline of Anticipation. Turn 1 if you have a Gemstone Cavern and a Leyline of Anticipation. The most powerful thing you can do with Jace seems to be to use the middle +1 ability here to plot a Valky God of Lies, and then on your following turn, cast Tibalt Cosmic Imposter for 0 mana. At one point in time, cascading into Tibalt Cosmic Imposter was like the most powerful deck in Modern's history. This is going to be a step below that. But what's very cool to me about like the plan of using Jace to cast Tibalt is that you are going to be able to like really effectively double spell when you go for it. You're going to be able to go like turn 4, cast Jace Reawakened with a counter spell up. You're going to be able to do it with a removal spell up. And then you're going to be able to plot your Tibalt, and then you're going to be able to cast Tibalt and potentially cast another spell again, which I think is pretty interesting. Power level wise, like if we were to imagine that Jace could be cast on the second or third turn of the game, this card I think would just be like incredibly powerful. It loots up to 4 loyalty, or it gives you +3 mana up to 4 loyalty immediately. I think there's even a chance that this card is good outside of decks that are trying to cast Tibalt Cosmic Imposter, just because it's like it like immediately can give you an extra mana the turn you play it, and then sets you up to double spell well, and then double spell the following turn. This is maybe going to be true more so in Standard and Pioneer than Modern, but I could potentially see this being a powerful Modern spell. Also, I've tried several times to build blue Devotion decks in Modern, and one like big problem I found with the archetype is kind of a lack of good 2-drops. that provide 2 devotion. There's like an interesting shell with like Enigma Jewel to activate Nykthos and Sunken Citadel to activate Nykthos, but you are just severely missing a good 2-drop. Is this card that card? Maybe, especially because you can cast it off Leyline of Anticipation. Maybe, maybe not, but that would be more so like a fun like pet deck to explore rather than big impactful modern deck. But I think Jace is really exciting. I think the card is good, but it is certainly one of the most difficult to evaluate cards I've ever talked about, and we will definitely see. It should maybe go without saying, but you can never really evaluate a card without getting your hands on it for a few rounds. I've definitely played a lot of prowess decks in Modern over the years, and one big issue the deck has had is it's missing one more good prowess threat. Swift Spear is very good, Dragon Rage's Channeler is very good, Questing Druid is very good, Soulscar Mage, Sprite Dragon are pretty mediocre. I think Slickshot Showoff will be the new stock prowess threat. I think it'll be very good too. It is a 2-mana 1/2 flying haste. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, that means you Mishra's Bauble. Slickshot Showoff gets +2/+0 until end of turn. It can also be plotted, which means on usually turn 2 you can save it for next turn. I think this will be awesome if your opponent is like just telegraphing a removal spell, which is something that just kind of happens a lot when you play prowess. Your opponent has Fatal Push up, they have Leyline Binding up, but you just kind of have to play your threat. I think it's kind of interesting to just be able to plot it, make your opponent waste their mana. You didn't waste your mana, then you get to untap and cast it for 0 mana and potentially kill them next turn. Or potentially not. Maybe we'll just plot another one. Maybe you'll cast an Expressive Iteration and not cast Slickshot Showoff because you're blanking their mana. I think there would be some really cool decisions and play patterns with the plot on the Showoff. Potentially also you could lean into a build that plays more protection spells like Blossoming Defense, and set up to where you're plotting it, then you're untapping with like protection and mutagenic growths and baubles and just going to kill your opponent on turn 2. This could be a pretty viable strategy. I to some extent the card is just like so good that like, yep, this goes in prowess, and that's kind of like the end of the conversation for me. Slick Sequence is a really, really interesting card to me. I could just be totally off about this, but to me this feels like a power crept Electrolyze that does require you to jump through a little hoop first. 2 mana, deal 2 damage to any target. If you've cast another spell this turn, draw a card. The upside to me seems really, really high. It just kind of simply put, if this card just said 2 mana, deal 2 damage to any target, draw a card, this would be immediate modern staple, 4 of it Murktide, I think 4 of it in a lot of control decks, just incredibly, incredibly good spell. This card does not say that. You have to cast another spell to draw the card, although you can still just, kill a Dothy Voidwalker for 2 mana, which is not going to be the worst exchange ever. If you have Mishra's Bauble with this card, you're going to get to do it on turn 2, which will be great. But I think there's a very good chance that Murktide, other tempo strategies are wanting to play this in some number where it's just very easy to double spell in Murktide. And if you're getting to double spell, you're getting to do this. I think it's going to be very good. So have very high hopes for this card. This is another one of those like difficult to evaluate spells, but I'm a believer in Slick Sequence. You might be a little surprised to see Giraffe this high on my list here, but I've been playing some Monastery Mentor decks recently. I went 10-3 on stream with a Jeskai build, and kind of the whole time I'm thinking that Giraffe is I think a little bit better than Monastery Mentor. Giraffe is a 3-mana 2/3. Whenever you cast a spell during your turn other than your first spell, make a 2/2 black zombie, and whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1 counter on it for each other zombie that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So 2/2, 3/3, 4/4, etc. If you haven't played Monastery Mentor decks, they're kind of like they're just Reanimator decks where it isn't good to play this for 3 mana most of the time, although you will go Giraffe into Mishra's Bauble and it'll be like okay or whatever. But what you want to be doing is you want to be unearthing, helping handing this into play, and then casting a couple of spells to cast like 3 spells on turn 3 and really get ahead for that rate. So they're like mini Reanimator decks that get to play increased card quality and have a lower fail rate because you can just cast your Giraffe much easier than you can cast it in a track. So this is at least how I like to think about these strategies. And what I really like about Giraffe, the biggest thing is that it's blue. Usually when I try to play these Mentor lists, like Mentor is like basically the only white card in the deck. Occasionally you'll play like Faithful Mending, some Prismatic Endings and stuff. But being just blue lets you like really be very flexible in the colors that you play. If you want to play Unearth over Helping Hand, you can do that a lot easier because your colors are less restricted. you're just much more free in like the color combinations you can play, which I think is very exciting. Also, being able to trigger it off of creatures that you cast is like, I think, surprisingly relevant. Like on turn 3, you can go reanimate, draw off, play a Dragon Rage's Channeler, make a zombie, then play your Mishra's Bauble, which I think is kind of cool. Of course, only triggering off of your second plus spells on a turn is a pretty big downside. So it's gonna be a little bit worse with cards like Force of Negation. But that being said, I think that this will be an upgrade to the like the Mentor style strategy. I think you could potentially also just play a split of Mentor and Draw, which could be kind of cool. I don't necessarily expect these decks to be amazing, but I do expect this to like lend to the best version of these decks we've seen, which I have high hopes for. Legion Extruder is a card that has me pretty confused, to be honest. I think the card is great. I think the card is really, really good, but it wants you to build a deck around it to be doing the Legion Extruder thing. You're doing something that I think you're not very incentivized to do in Modern, which has me kind of confused. But it's a 2-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target. I love this part about the card. I think it's great that your like engine piece impacts the board the turn it comes down. If your opponent plays a creature, you play Extruder, kill this, and then you have this engine in play. I think it's really exciting. And you can spend 2 mana, tap it, sacrifice another artifact to make a 3/3 Golem creature token. So I think this card obviously goes very well with Goblin Engineer. Any artifact with ETB effects go really nicely with Goblin Engineer. If you're playing an Engineer deck, you're playing a deck that has a lot of artifacts you want to sack. Synthesizer is kind of one of the main ones. Oni Cult Anvil is also going to give you a steady stream of artifacts to sacrifice and turn into golems. The problem with this archetype is your deck is like really slow and has a difficult time racing big mana strategies, and also can just get blown out by artifact hate pretty badly. Although it is true that these kind of archetypes are a bit more resilient to like Force of Vigor and stuff, because you have like Engineer to recur, you have a lot of built-in card advantage. A lot of your stuff doesn't really mind being destroyed anyways. But we'll see. I would love for this card to be like in a good Modern deck, and this may be one of those kind of cards that just like needs 2 or 3 more support pieces for this sort of archetype to be good. But I do think we are getting there slowly but surely. Kind of on the flip side of that, I think Insatiable Avarice is a kind of medium plus card that goes in good Modern decks, and kind of the opposite of Legion Extruder, which is a very good card that goes in like medium minus decks. Insatiable Avarice is a medium plus card that goes in good decks. So it's going to see more play, maybe despite being lower card quality. But this is a spree card, which means for 1 black mana it does nothing, but you can add effects to nothing, either spending black to make target player draw 3 cards and lose 3 life, or search the library for a card, then shuffle, then put it on top. So this is kind of like a much better mono black Painful Truths. It's been a while since I've registered Painful Truths, but I have done it in the last couple of years in like an Obosh shadow deck in the sideboard, which is kind of fringe, I know, but being mono black is way better than like costing you 3 colors, since mono black coffers and mono black non-coffers are both like pretty competitive real strategies in the format. There's also a like secret mode on this card that will come up a lot, of targeting your opponent with Insatiable Avarice. If you have a Shieldred, if you have an Orcish Bowmaster in play, if you have both, this is going to just one-shot your opponent and a lot of the time. If you have a Bowmaster in play, it's going to deal them 6 damage. If you have a Shieldred and give your Orc +3/+3, if you have a Shieldred, it's going to deal them 9 damage. It's going to just kind of win games out of nowhere, which I think is pretty exciting. And also, you're going to be able to do all both modes on the card a lot of times in your Coffers builds. So I think it's probably more of a Coffers card than like the mono black mid-range decks, but we'll see. I think this card is pretty good. I think it's unlikely to be a 4 of, but another thing to note is that the 3-drop slot in these mono black decks has been pretty empty for a while. Like they've kind of been missing a good 3-mana play, and this may just kind of like fill that role really well. Good card advantage spell, good to close games out with Shieldred and Orcish Bowmaster. Another kind of tricky 2-mana creature to evaluate, we have Nathan's World Championship Invitational custom card, Duelist of the Mind. 2 mana, star 3 Flying Vigilance, power equal to the number of cards you've drawn this turn. Whenever you commit a crime, you may draw a card. If you do discard a card, this ability triggers only once each turn. So I've been kind of thinking about what you might do with this card. One card I think it plays really nicely with is Lava Dart, where Lava Dart is a card that both commits a crime for you and also is a good card to loot away. And if you loot it away, you can flash it back for 0 mana and commit another crime. I think that that's kind of interesting. Card reminds me a lot of Ledger Shredder, this like 2 mana flying, 3 toughness creature that loots you a bunch over the course of the game, and also plays pretty well with Ledger Shredder, because if you have both in play and you've connived, you're going to get an extra power on your Duelist of Mind for that turn. Also, multiple copies of Duelist of the Mind will play pretty well together. I was also kind of thinking about like if you played this in like a blue-black ring deck or a ring control deck. If you have the ring in play, you're drawing a ton of cards. It's kind of an interesting win condition, maybe a little bit win more. But I think that's kind of that could be an interesting place to play Duelist of the Mind. At the moment, I'm thinking though that it is a powerful and interesting card that is likely a level below other 2 mana creatures, other creatures you could play in its slot. But I would love to find a niche spot to play Duels of the Mind, and it would be so cool to get to cast some Nathans one day. Outlaws of Thunder Junction is kind of the set of like interesting and powerful 2 mana creatures, which I'm definitely very about. Brisly Bill, Spine Sower, awesome name, awesome art, love everything about this card. 2 mana 2/2 Plant Druid. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1 counter on target creature. In a fetch land format, this is a lot of times going to be turn 3, 4 power, spread across multiple bodies potentially, maybe more if you have Hardened Scales in play, and then threatening to do a lot more over the course of the game too, giving you more landfall triggers. And also, if activating this ability, sometimes 5 mana, double the number of +1 counters on each creature you control. There's actually a similar effect to this, Roaring Earth, which is a card I've considered building around a few times off stream. It's also a 2 mana green card that has landfall, put a counter on target creature, or this one says or vehicle you control, and you can occasionally play this as like a really really mediocre creature if you channel it instead. It also kind of reminds me of Brushfire Elemental, which is another 2 mana landfall creature that gives you a lot of power and toughness on the board. And I've actually liked Brushfire Elemental in some like elemental strategies in the past. This was, pre-Orcish Bowmaster, but it was a card that, I kind of liked in the format for a while. And so Brisly Bill reminds me of Brushfire Elemental, Roaring Earth, comparing it to these cards. But I don't know. I think this card is good. It's also a plant, which could be relevant in Insidious Roots Shell, double the counter on all your root stuff. Maybe that's more of like a standard Pioneer thing. But I would love to build a non-artifact focused Hardened Scales deck with this. And I would also love to see if this is just like a good card in Domain Zoo. If you just are like gonna play like 2 copies of this card in your Domain Zoo deck, and all of a sudden you can put counters on your Scion of Draco and make your Scions bigger than their Scions, your Kavus bigger than their Kavus, and also it's just 4 power for 2 mana, which is like about where you want to be in that archetype anyways. I have high hopes for this card. I would love for it to be a really good modern 2-drop. We also have yet another upgrade to Stoneforge Mystic for both hammer builds and mid-range builds alike. Cryptic Co was a big upgrade to Stoneforge Mystic. We had some success with blue-white X mid-range Stoneblade, as well as like Cryptic Co and hammer after the last set release. And I think Assimilation Aegis also will go into basically all of these strategies. This is like an O-ring tutorable equipment. It's a 3 mana, enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target creature until it leaves the battlefield. And as long as it's attached to a creature, for as long as it remains attached, that creature becomes a copy of whatever you exile to this. I think that is going to be mostly flavor text on this card, but will occasionally like be like a nice upside. I'm definitely like happy to have that here. And I do think that you're going to play this in basically every Stoneforge Mystic deck, but I don't necessarily think it isn't going to be the kind of card that pushes Stoneforge Mystic strategies over the top. It's just a nice, interesting tool. It is good that it pitches to both Force and like Solitude and Subtlety too in the blue-white builds of these decks. So I think that at the moment, if I was going to play a Stoneforge Mystic mid-range deck in Modern, I'd play one of this, one Cryptic Co, one Cauldra as like the de facto package, and then hope and cope that Stoneblade decks will be good in Modern again. Mori Vault, to some extent, feels like it's a card that was like designed specifically for me, or like specifically for all these like Mystic Forge combo decks, all these Enigma Jewels, Sunken Still decks that I like to play. It is a colorless utility land, and there are a lot of those in Modern at the moment. But you have the ability to spend 3 mana, discard a card, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts you control, put one of those into your hand, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. Um, I think this card, I would love to play this card in Enigma Jewel Sunken Citadel Cave, where you have like this as like a mana sink for your activated abilities. Engines that are also digging you for like some of your bigger payoffs. I've also played like a lot of Mystic Forge based artifact combo decks, sometimes with like Semblance Anvil as a mana engine, occasionally as with like Everflowing Chalice and ways to put charge counters as the mana engine. And these decks really like to like find Mystic Forge and use this as a card advantage engine, find like this top end, and like having some copies of Mori Vault to like dig for these payoffs, I think is pretty exciting. Again, it's going to be like this kind of niche utility land that just goes into all of these brews. I just love so much. There's also a cycle of joins up cards from the new set. These are the only two that I think really have any potential modern implications. And they're both pretty good with the card Nor and the Wary, so I wanted to talk about both of them together. So Kell Join Up is a Bant 3-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your hand. If you do, it becomes plotted. So if you plot another 3-mana spell, Kell Joins Up gives you back the mana you spent to cast it, albeit at a later turn. And then it says, whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a counter on each creature you control. So if you have a Nor and the Wary, this is going to Gavany Township a counter on each creature you control twice a turn cycle, probably, which is pretty interesting. Is it something that you're very incentivized to do in Modern? No, but boy does it sound super interesting to me. It sounds really interesting. There's potentially, I don't think there's necessarily a way you can combo with this at the moment, but maybe one day. You also have Tiny Bones Jones Up, 1-mana black enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, any number of target players each discard a card. Could maybe make yourself discard a card occasionally if you have some graveyard synergies, like if you have Bloodghast in your hand. But you're mostly so it's nice that this is like not card disadvantage, right? You play it, they discard a card. And it also says whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, any number of players each mill a card and lose a life. So if you have those graveyard synergies where you're making yourself discard a card, you can also like churn through your deck really fast by making yourself mill, which is interesting. But also with Nor and the Wary, this is like 2 life loss for your opponent every single turn. Also, if you remember, Nor and the Wary, very good with Satoru. I guess I should probably read this card. I guess not everyone is familiar with Modern staple Nor and the Wary. 1 mana, 1 red mana, 2/1 human warrior, legendary creature. Whenever a player plays a spell or a creature attacks, remove Nor and the Wary from the game, return it to play under its owner's control at the end of turn. So every time, Norn is very wary. Every time someone attacks or someone casts a spell, Norn will have a bad feeling about this, leave the battlefield, and come back, triggering these kind of effects over and over and over again, drawing potentially 2 cards a turn with Satoru. I would love to Tiny Bones Nori. I'd love to Kellen Joins Up Norin, but this is likely going to be something we explore a little bit later into the season. We have another interesting build around the 2-mana creatures, Malcolm the Eyes, 2-mana 2/2 flying haste. It may be a little bit I don't know, those stats just impress me for some reason. They're not good. They're not that good. 2-mana 2/2 flying haste in the context of Modern, not that exciting. But it's kind of cool to see that with like a big upside. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, investigate. So again, Mishra's Bauble, good with everything. Reminds me a lot of Ledger Shredder, needing that second spell to do a thing. This thing is investigating, which is probably a little worse than conniving, although you could make a deck potentially like with Urza Lord High Artificer, maybe with the 3-mana 2/3 that makes activated abilities of artifacts cost 1 less, cast an artifact, investigate, build around this effect a little bit. Ruthless Lawbringer is a card that I like a lot. It's probably not as good as to the degree that I like it, but it's a 3-mana 3/2 vampire. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy a target non-land permanent. So in combination with like specifically Bloodghast, maybe we get some other good vampires to sacrifice, it is going to be a 3-mana 3/2 that blows up your opponent's best thing, which is pretty dang good. I've also like just been doing pretty well with like a black white Sorin Vein Ripper Pox deck, and that I could potentially see playing this card in some builds of that deck too, which I think is pretty exciting. It is also notably an assassin, so that in the new Assassin's Creed set that's coming out later this year, that we know that that has some assassin synergies in the set. Maybe you could do something with this. I think the card is very cool. It is a black white card that requires you to sacrifice creatures, so it's gonna be pretty fringe playable. But it's a card I like super like, and will definitely think about it as a good archetype role player in those kind of strategies. Okay, time to talk about the very controversial Lost Jitte. Some people love it, some people hate it. Let's talk about it. Card is basically half an Umazal's Jitte. Cost 1 mana instead of 2 mana. Cost 1 mana to equip instead of 2 mana to equip. And just like Umazal's Jitte, it gets counters whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage, but it gets 1 counter instead of 2 counters. The modes are different though. You can either untap target land, so make a mana, or make 3 mana if you have a Lotus Field or a Urza's Tower with Tron. Target creature can't block this turn or put a +1 counter on equipped creature. When this card got spoiled, I said that it was better than Umazawa's Jitte. Would be theoretically, and largely like kind of tiebreaker maybe, because you can find enough Saga. This was kind of controversial. I will say that I mostly think this too, because I think Umazawa's Jitte would just be really mediocre in modern. You know what the old Jitte did really well, right? Was it let you win creature combat. If you're playing a game that is about creature combat, creatures attacking, blocking, trading, you're going to win those games. What I think maybe some people don't know or don't realize, whatever, is modern is not about that. Modern is not about attacking and blocking, figuring out how to best attack with your creatures and trade creatures and stuff. It is very, very rare for games to be about that. And when they are, they're like usually Leyline Scion mirrors where all creatures have like lifelink, flying, hexproof, trample. And it's just so far away from Umazawa's Jitte. So I do think Lost Jitte does have like real interesting applications in the format. I think it's could be a cool hardened scales tutor target, a card that you're also like probably pretty happy to draw naturally. Of course, you know, getting the extra counters has a lot of synergy with your scales. Scales can also be a pretty mana hungry deck, so like storing Lotus Petals by putting counters on Lost Jitte could be pretty cool. Also, getting through lethal combat damage by removing blockers is a pretty relevant thing to be doing in your scales deck. So I think as a one of your flex spots and scales, it's gonna be something I'm going to be trying for a while. And then I also think that in like the Dice Factory brews I like to play, it's like a mandatory one of that may end up wanting you to play more copies. So this card to me is like a mandatory one of in those decks because it's like an ever-flowing chalice that you can tutor with Saga, but it does not require you to tap it to make a mana, which is a pretty big deal. Where a lot of times in these kind of, you know, Dice Factory combo decks, you are like churning through your deck with like a one ring that you're untapping with keys, or you are churning through your deck with a Mystic Forge, and you find a lot of ways to put charge counters on things. You find copies of Core Tapper, you find copies of Power Conduit, you find copies of Surge Node. But at this point in your turn, all of your stuff is tapped, and you kind of can't keep churning through your deck. So being able to put the charge counters on Lost Jitte and just be able to untap stuff without needing to tap it, I think is a really interesting tool. So like kind of mandatory one of in these decks, and potentially you could build around this card further by playing Lotus Field and untapping Lotus Field. So each charge counter you put on something represents 3 mana, like it's like a black Lotus instead of a Lotus Petal. Or maybe you could also do it in a Tron build, and you know, it's also could be 3 mana instead of 1 mana, which I think could be very, very cool. This is certainly like the spot where I think that Jitte will have like the highest upside. I don't expect this card to go in Hammer Time very often. I am kind of I really want to put this card on a Fervent Champion on turn 2. But I don't know. It kind of seems like we're a little bit far away from like the Fervent Champion world that we used to live in. So cool card, excited to play with it. Umazawa's Jitte sucks. Okay, Sim Synthesizer is a card that a lot of people are really excited for. 3 mana, enters the battlefield, scry 2. Whenever another artifact with mana value 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you make a construct artifact with power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts you control. There are a lot of 3 mana artifacts, enchantment creatures in Magic that if you untap with them and you've built around this card and you do your thing, you get to make a lot of advantage. These cards are basically never good because it's kind of easy to remove this thing and then stop your opponent's deck from functioning. This card is different because of how it interacts with cards like Frogmite, Sojourner's Companion, Mirror Enforcer, Thought Monitor. If you have enough affinity, especially with Frogmite, you play this card on turn 3, maybe turn 2 off a Springleaf Drum, and then you play a Frogmite, Sojourner's Companion. You get to do the thing immediately. You get to get immediate value off the card, which is a big difference from other kind of 3-mana build-around cards. That being said, I could definitely see if you play this at Affinity, it like clunks up your deck a little bit, raises the curve, is sort of a win more card that is only good in games where you're curving out and then have a bunch of Affinity cards to play, which is kind of tough, and also does not solve the Affinity problem of being like kind of a slower aggro deck that has a hard time killing like on turn 3 and is also like very weak to Force of Vigor and other artifact hate. Does not solve these problems, but if it goes in any deck, it's Affinity, and you will definitely have some really exciting turns with the card. So in addition to Lost Jitte, there's another tutorable 1-mana equipment from the set, Lava Spur Boots. I think this one is like a slam dunk fit into Hammer Time, and it's kind of funny. I think Jitte is an upgrade to Scales, and I think Spurt Boots is likely an upgrade to Hammer Time. It is a 1-mana equipment, of course, equips for 1 mana, gives equipped creature +1/+0, haste, and ward 1. So very nice to just get this, make it Urza Saga token, grab this, equip onto the Saga token, and attack for a bunch. This is like definitely like your plan B a lot of time in Hammer Time, Affinity, a little bit less so in Scales, but of course also in Scales, just, you know, Urza Saga decks in general. But also the ward helps you play around opponent's removal really well. Like if you have a hammer you want to put on something, you can put this on first to see, you know, kind of tax them with ward. Also putting it on Esper Sentinel both makes your Sentinel harder to kill, which is great, and then also like makes your opponent have to pay 2 or give you a card off Sentinel. And I've definitely played with a lot of 2-power Esper Sentinels in my day, and it is, you know, twice as good as a 1-power Esper Sentinel. So I expect this to be stock in Hammer Time, playable in other Urza Saga decks, but Hammer Time continues to be like the worst modern deck probably, so we'll see. There are a couple more interesting Spree cards in the set, 3 Steps Ahead and Final Showdown. Remember, Spree, 1 mana do nothing, then start adding modes for more mana. 3 Steps Ahead is kind of like Archmage's Charm, 3 mana counter a spell, or 3 mana draw 2, discard a card instead of just draw 2, which is, of course, a little bit worse. But unlike Archmage's Charms, you can add the modes instead of just choosing one. So in the late game, you can get like extra advantage off of these, which is kind of interesting. The other mode is for 3 extra mana, create a token of a target creature or artifact you control, which in these kind of in decks that are interested in playing slow counter spells will unfortunately just be not that relevant. I expect this card to be not very good, see not very much play, unless there is like some way to like just tutor like 1 mana spells to your hand, like Micromancer, but good. Like if we got like Spell Seeker in MH3, then all of a sudden 3 Steps Ahead would be a card I'd be like pretty down to register as one of. If you could make use also of this mode, the copy mode, then the card will be really good. The problem for me is like it just seems very tough to do that. Maybe copying Solitude Solitude Subtlety is good enough. Maybe copying the ring, like resetting ring is good, but at the moment I don't see it. But maybe it could be one of the cards that kind of impresses you, surprises you after playing with it a little bit. Also, Final Showdown, it's kind of like a white dress down, although certainly worse. White, just for the base, and then +1 mana. All creatures lose all activated abilities till end of turn. Lose all abilities till end of turn. So this is like 2 mana, kill all constructs, which is, you know, pretty good in the Urza Saga format. Also, for an extra mana, you can have a creature you control gain indestructible. So it can be a cool combat trick for 2 or 3 mana. And then for 6 total mana, you can destroy all creatures at instant speed, which is going to be an interesting late game tool. I like that if you're playing this in like a white control deck, it's like kill all Urza Saga tokens for 2 mana, and then in the late game, kill all creatures. I think this is really cool. It's also an instant speed board wipes if you played it in like a Reclamation deck, which could be kind of cool. Gonna be like a fringe control deck tool, but one that I think like I will be pretty interested in, like maybe just having one in my sideboard at first in blue-white control, and then if it impresses, then maybe we play one in the main in certain metagames, we'll play 2 in the side. We will We will see. Also, like in some mono white decks like Martyr, you could also play more copies of this card. Gold Vein Hydra is a really exciting card. That I'm having a hard time evaluating. It is X green, Vigilance, Trample, Haste. Enters with X counters. When it dies, make a number of tapped treasures equal to its power. There have been a lot of different like X color +1 counter cards. There's been Shivan Devastator. There's been the blue one that you remove a counter, you draw a card. One interesting thing is all these cards are tutorable off Ranger Captain of Eos. So if you find yourself playing like a Heliod with a green splash for like Haywire Might, would you maybe also play a Gold Vein Hydra as like a big top end tutor effect for a Ranger Captain? Maybe you would. I know I definitely would have if Up the Beanstalk were still legal, which it's not. I also think that there is maybe going to be a way to combo with this card. Like if you can, like if you have like Heartless Summoning in play, this card will make more treasure tokens than it costs you mana to spend it, but the tokens entering tapped likely means that you probably can't combo with this without like an Amulet of Vigor, which is going to be too many pieces. But the card is interesting. It has a lot of text on it. It's tutorable with Ranger Captain. It has haste. It has vigilance. It has trample. To me, it seems like kind of not the thing you really want to be doing in Modern that often. But like many cards from Outlaws, it's interesting, and it could just be end up playing a lot better than it reads. So have your eyes out on this one, but don't expect it to do a lot outside of very fringe cases with Ranger Captain. So Flibble Flip Lost on the Range is another one of these like super interesting, very difficult to evaluate creatures that I just will need to play with it before I can really tell you how good or bad it is. But it is a 3 mana 1/1. That's not that good. But it has Ward 2. I really can't just overstate how good the Ward ability is in Modern. Like the format is so about these really efficient removal spells, and having creatures with Ward 2 makes your opponent's like mana efficiency so tough. Especially a lot of times they'll hold up 1 or 2 mana on your instep to remove your creature, but if it just has Ward, then you get to blank all of their mana on that turn, and then they untap and they still have to spend extra mana to kill this thing. And what's cool about this card is it's like a must kill. You can plot spells from the top of your library for their mana value. So you're future sighting, just casting spells from the top of your library, delayed by a turn. But it's a very powerful recursive card advantage engine that your opponent must kill, and they have to pay extra mana to kill it. Which to me makes this card interesting. It is, I can't think of a single deck that exists in Modern that it would currently go into, which is a problem. But it is certainly on my radar. I would love to find a home for it. And it's also important to remember with this card and all of these like interesting Outlaws cards. There's a lot of cards here that I think are powerful and don't really fit into something necessarily. But we're about to have Modern Horizons 3. And they're like the whole format I think is going to look different after Modern Horizons 3. And so keeping these like powerful cards in your head that don't really fit into a deck at the moment, is just really important to do when the format is about to change so much. So remember Flibble Flip. I may never cast this card, but boy, do I want to. So whenever you see a 2 mana spell that says cast a card without paying its mana cost, you got to look kind of closely at this. This is Collector's Cage, 2 mana Hideaway 5. Look, when it enters the battlefield, you're going to look at the top 5 cards of your library, exile one of them face down, the rest on the bottom in the random order, and then you can spend 1 mana, tap it, put a counter on a creature you control. Then if you have 3 or more creatures with different powers, you get to cast that exiled card for free. That's interesting. I think the best way to like manipulate the power and toughness of your creatures for this are going to be like the best one maybe Wall of Roots, where this will give you a creature with negative power if you want it, which like it'll just be so easy to like have like a negative power creature, 1/1, 2/2, 0 power creature maybe. In addition to the Collector's Cage, it's also give you extra mana to like play those creatures, and you can go like Wall of Roots, put a counter on it, play like a Young Wolf, for example. Probably not literally Young Wolf, but 1 mana creature. The next turn, play another creature off the roots, then cage, play it, activate it. Also, if you play this in Hardened Scales, you can have lots of creatures with different power. Obviously, the Collector's Cage's counter ability is a lot better in a Hardened Scales deck. But the problem is, like, if you're playing either of these, like, how do you have Emrakul or like something crazy to cast off of this? Do you need something crazy to cast off of this? Are you just happy playing like a 3 or 4 drop off of it? I don't know. The card is very interesting to me. I have splashed white for hardened scales in the past for like Esper Sentinel, and um could definitely see playing like a couple of copies of this in a flex spot. One big issue though with like playing this in scales is a lot of your like good cards are 0/0s basically, like Ballista, Hangerback Walker are not good hits off of this, which is kind of tough, but certainly on my radar. Another one of these cards that could just absolutely surprise it. Like you just kind of cannot underrate like a 2 mana artifact that is generating board presence and can cast a spell for free. Keep it in your mind, keep it in your hearts. So High Noon is the best Rule of Law effect we've ever seen in Modern. Rule of Law effects have almost never been playable in Modern, though, which is kind of an interesting dynamic because they're 3 mana. Though this one is a 2 mana. Each player cannot cast more than one spell each turn, and for 5 mana, you can sacrifice to deal 5 damage to any target, which is kind of an interesting upside. I think that this is going to be mostly a sideboard card and a pretty good sideboard card in some metagames. Some of the cards have here next to High Noon are cards that you might play alongside it if you're main decking it. If you're main decking High Noon, could you use High Noon as a way to add symmetry to Moderation? Moderation is a 3 mana enchantment that says you can't play more than one spell a turn, and then whenever you play a spell, draw a card. So what if you went High Noon into Moderation and then like evoked a Solitude on your opponent's turn, and then they're stuck playing only one spell a turn, and you're playing one spell a turn, but you're drawing an extra card every time. Probably not very good, but something I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about High Noon. Reprieve, I think, is going to be a card you see like a little bit more often, where Reprieve is like this really exciting new remand tool for white decks, and if your opponent can only cast one spell a turn, bouncing that spell back to their hand and drawing a card is like a really nice way to like just strand stuff that they're doing. Also, Spell Queller, these kind of effects, like if your opponent is using a spell to kill your Queller, they won't be able to play the spell exile to it. So Spell Queller and effects like this are really nice with High Noon. This is like, again, if you're going to main deck High Noon, these are the kind of cards you would play with it. I think it's very unlikely you would main deck High Noon in the current Modern environment. It's also not that likely you would sideboard it necessarily, but it is likely you'd sideboard at some point. So again, for me, mostly a sideboard card. Could build around it. I'm not that excited to build around it. Lids, keep going. So for Sewer Enjoyers, there's another good 2 mana sideboard card. I have High Noon kind of over Pest Control, even though they're both sideboard cards. Like you could maybe build around this one, right? So a little bit higher. Pest Control is like a really, really good sideboard card. 2 mana, destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less. It also has cycling. I think cycling means that you could main deck this in some metagames that this effect is really good and just cycle it when it's bad. I have heard a lot of like Hammer players, Scales players, Asthma players being very scared of Pest Control. One thing that's really good news for you is this card is black white, and there are just not that many black white decks in Modern. It's like Goryo's Vengeance and like Shitty Brews, end of list really for for decks that play both black and white. This will be a very good sideboard card for Goryo's decks though, where it just like destroys all of your cheap graveyard hate and all your creatures and stuff and pitches to Grief and Solitude. We'll definitely see play in that deck, but um, I don't think you need to be so scared of it if you're playing like Scales, Hammer, or Asmo, because like your deck is already really weak to cards like Explosives. This card is not ultimately that different from Engineered Explosives. Hidetsuka consumes all these kind of effects. People can play them if they want to. And because it's such restrictive casting cost, you are, I don't think, gonna see it that often. Okay, another sideboard card. It's kind of like the mono white Wear Tear. Another spree card, white, and then for an extra mana, you can destroy an artifact. For an extra mana, you can destroy an enchantment. So kind of like the same as Wear Tear, albeit at sorcery speed. You can destroy both an artifact and an enchantment. And then for an additional mana, you can also put a counter on each creature target player controls. So I guess technically this could commit a crime for you if you wanted to target your opponent, but usually you're going to target yourself. So this is going to be a Wear Tear that you play in white decks where you want access to that effect, but you don't necessarily want to splash red. And it gets a little bit extra value if you care about the +1 counters. So this could fit a variety of decks. Wear Tear likely still better, but you'll play this card sometimes, and just keep it on your mind when you're building your white base sideboards. We also have a couple of kind of boring living in cards. It's good to talk about them. Good to give the living in players some love. You have Harvester of Misery, 5 mana, 5/4. Enters the battlefield. Other creatures get -2/-2 end of turn. It is kind of cool that this is like pretty relevant ETB when you're living ending sometimes. It also kills. Most of what this card is doing is killing a Dothy Voidwalker for 2 mana and then killing it again when it comes back at post living end. It's also a black card, so it pitches to grief. This will be a toolbox card, flex spot kind of card, not the most. I doubt it's going to be like stock in Living Index. The art is also really, really cool. There's also Spinewood's Armadillo, 6 mana, 7/7, reach ward 3. So like gigantic body on the card, and you can also discard it to search your library for any basic land or a desert, really any basic land in Living End. And then also gaining 3 life. So the life gain on it's really nice. 7/7, ward 3 reach is huge. Could be a little slow being 2 mana to discard instead of 1, and also being a land cycler that costs 2 mana to discard is kind of tough, but the body is kind of crazy. So I would expect to potentially see some people trying this card out, and then we'll let the living end experts decide if it's good enough or not. So I have a couple cards here that I think are likely not playable, but they're on my radar. Radar cards I used to call them. So this is Colossal Rattle Worm, which is it's so funny, but like, yeah, this card sucks. It's a 4 mana 6/5 trample, flash as long as you control a desert. But what I most like about this card is if it's in your graveyard, it's a rampant growth. So like a great in your graveyard rampant growth that like triggers Insidious Roots is kind of cool. At the moment, I can just not see myself putting this in any modern deck. Could there be desert synergies that I've missed? I don't think that there are like good ones that I've missed. Maybe there are. But this is like a really unique effect, like a rampant growth from the graveyard. Has to find a desert, can't find a basic land, but it's something that like has caught my attention, and maybe I'll put it in a deck one day. Kind of the same thing with Frontier Seeker. 2 mana, 2/1. Look at top 5 cards of your library. Reveal a mount or planes from among them, put into your hand. So if this hits a planes, it's pretty good. 2 mana, 2/1. Put a planes into your hand. Is something that Death and Taxes players might be excited for. Don't think there are any playable mounts now, but if there are playable mounts later, like if there's like a modern staple mount at MH3, then you might play this card. So again, these kind of cards are like, they're toolbox cards. They're cards that like are just good to know about if you're building a deck. They're just good to know about. They're interesting. They do a very unique thing. They do a very special thing. But you're not going to expect to put them into a deck anytime soon. You're going to need future support or a lot of creativity. Okay, and then we have what I think is the most confusing card in the set for me. Doc Arlock, Grizzle Genius, kind of in the same vein as these two. A card that I don't think has a deck it can go in, nor does it really have like a lot of support, but could be very broken one day, or it could be very good one day. It says spells you cast from your graveyard or exile cost 2 less. Plotting cards from your hand also cost 2 less. This kind of mana reduction on a 2 mana creature is definitely worth looking at. As far as I can tell, there are just not that many good spells to be casting from the graveyard to like really want to put this in your deck, build around it. Same thing from exile, same thing for plotting. It would be really good with the new Flibble Flip, but Flibble Flip plots from the top of your library, not from your hand, which I was pretty excited about it for a little while. Could, again, if MH3 has like some good spells to cast in the graveyard, you could definitely be playing it, but they're just like, there aren't a density of good flashback spells, spells that you're casting from exile, I think, for you to want to put this in your deck. But it just has such a like intense cost reduction. Like I don't think there's another 2 mana creature in Magic, at least in Modern, that has like a static 2 mana cost reduction. So for that, it is definitely worth knowing about, thinking about. But at the moment, I don't think there's a deck for it.